Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our February 3rd Tuesday at 3 webcast series, Hybrid IT for SMBs. I'm Alan Falcon, CEO of Cumulus Global, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day and week to join us here this afternoon, either as you're attending our live broadcast of this webinar or watching it on demand. Before I get into the meat of the content today, a couple of housekeeping items. As always, the audio is muted to prevent any background noises from getting in the way. So please use the questions window for any questions or comments you have. The icon to access is across the top or right-hand side of your screen. And we do leave time for Q&A at the end of the presentation portion, as well as I will answer questions as I can in line with the presentation. If you're watching this on demand, we'll be sharing contact information shortly. Feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, or discussion points you want to follow up on. We're happy to have those conversations with you. This session is being recorded. We generally get them posted within 24 hours up on the website. We'll send you a link, and please feel free to share with colleagues if you think they'll find this content usable. As with this webcast, we have other webcast series, our Coffee and Cloud series, as well as a full range of information, resources, and dynamic content available in the Resource Center on our website. I invite you to check that out at your convenience. So again, thanks for joining us, and let's talk about hybrid IT for small and mid-sized companies. And we're going to start out today by defining hybrid work and what hybrid IT means. We'll talk about some of the challenges that small businesses face, particularly given the perception of the infrastructure required and some of the operating aspects of being a hybrid organization. We'll talk about how to manage it all. A good pun there with manage IT all, as far as what to look for and what to think about as you change your IT to support your hybrid work environment. And we'll talk about 3 strategies, and we want you to use all of them as you're able to achieve that hybrid IT support for your hybrid business. And we'll talk about what you need to do to take the next step from wherever you are in your journey with respect to cloud and hybrid computing, as well as your hybrid business model. And so starting in defining hybrid work, there are really 2 types of hybrid work that have come to be defined. One is really looking at it at the organizational level, and the other is at the individual level. So organizationally, a hybrid organization is one where employees work on-premise and remotely. And those individual employees may be on-premise, remote, or both, meaning individually hybrid, right? So an individual hybrid employee is one who splits their work time between on-premise and remote, as opposed to being fully remote or fully in office. And what's interesting when we start talking about how organizations manage hybrid work, one of the questions that comes into play is what's the environment where all of your employees are working at? And so certainly in the past, in prior webcasts and in blog posts, we've talked about, if an employee is working regularly from home, as the employer, you still have a responsibility to make sure that's an appropriate work environment, that there's sufficient space, lighting, ergonomics, technology, support, communications, etc., as if they were in the office as well. So the health and safety of the environment your employees are working in really fall to your responsibility, whether or not they're in the office or they're using a home office, a co-working location, or they're a little bit more mobile than that. And what we see now with organizations is you think about, and this is probably more true with larger companies, some that, certainly enterprise and mid-market, but even our larger small businesses, is they look at their office space. If they know that at any given day, 25 or 50 or 60% of their workforce is going to be out of office, working remotely, they might change the way, or you might consider changing the way you allocate office and desk space. So some of the challenges you'll face is if you decide to do that is for individuals who may work remotely sometimes and may come into the office, are they going to continue to have a dedicated workspace in the office? And what would that look like if not? And how do you manage space allocation and preferences and needs across your workforce? Additionally, know that anyone who's, as I've said, working remotely Oftentimes we assume remote is at home, but it could be a co-work location. You have mobile employees, maybe a sales force that's on the road, and you might have them in different environments at different points of time. Okay. And just a reminder as we go in, I see someone's raised their hand. If you have any questions, open that questions window and type it away there. We'll be happy to answer. So when it comes to having a hybrid work environment, there are a number of challenges behind it. And I don't want to minimize the business side of things, because it really comes into very business process oriented things, such as people's roles and responsibilities and how do they fit with each other. How do you build teams? How do you establish and maintain a company culture? What level of communication and collaboration do you expect? How do you expect or want it to be different or potentially better than if people are on site all the time? What's your plan about supervising employees? And there's been a lot of back and forth about this, in discussion about companies putting in so-called productivity trackers, which are looking at keystrokes or looking at how active the mouse is, or even measuring how much time people spend actively typing in different applications that they use on a day-to-day basis, versus more of a trust model, or recognizing that knowing that your employees are being productive is really based on their output over time, not on how you measure tasks in physical motion, things of that nature. And so productivity is a huge concern. Now, general trends show that many jobs, roughly about half, can be done just or even more productively with people working remotely as they can with everyone in the office. And yet individuals may not be suited to that, and teams may not be suited to that. So there's a whole concept of how you manage the productivity. And also there's the cost, and that there's a different cost structure. In some aspects, there's savings, but there are other costs incurred when you've got folks working out of the office and in the office. And to support that hybrid work environment, there's a whole set of technology challenges. Do people have access to the systems they need? Do they have the ability to communicate and have access to those communication tools? Are your systems still adequately secure? And if you're in an industry or whereby industry standard or state or federal regulation, you've got security compliance issues. Is your remote environment the people are using also compliant? Are you providing people with their end user devices, or is it bring your own device? And how do you manage a BYOD program so that that people are still preventing viruses and access is secure and no one else has access to your company information on that device? A whole set of challenges there. We've done entire webcasts on that. And then, of course, what about performance, availability, and reliability of the environment that people are relying on since they're not in the office? And so we think about all these challenges. Having a hybrid work environment and culture can be really productive and provide employees with the flexibility and the work-life blend that they want to achieve. But you've got some serious business issues that you shouldn't just let happen. They require planning and decisions, and you want the technology to support those decisions and how they work. And so one of the big things that we often talk to people, businesses about, is the challenge of the user experience, right? And in making sure that whether people are in the office or remotely, their experience as an employee is the same. And from a technical side of things, and we can talk about on the business side, that's group participation, it's culture, it's access to peers and supervisors, it's visibility towards promotion. Those are the business side of the user experience. On the technology side, we're talking very basic things. How do people log in? What security hoops they have to jump through? How do they access their applications and their data? Does it perform well? Is the look and feel the same? And, all of that comes into play. And the question is really, granted, if someone's remote all the time, they have a user experience. If someone's in office all the time, they can have a user experience. It's really when you think about, well, who's moving between the two? And will they have the same experience? Will they be able to be as productive remotely as they are? And an example here is a very simple one. where and we walked through this, with a client of ours recently. We said, well, when someone comes into work in the morning, what happens? How do they start work? It's like, oh, to get ready for work, they have to open their laptop. They enter the password on the Windows screen, and boom, they see the desktop with their applications, and they can start work. They can click on the applications they need to use. They can check their email, whatever. So, okay, for your current employees, what's happening when they're working remotely? It's like, well, they open, they're at home. So they open the laptop, they have to enter the password. Now they see their desktop and their applications, but those aren't going to work. So they need to double click on the VPN. They need to enter another username and password. They need to wait for a connection. And then it really diverged. Then there were some people who say, okay, now they're connected. The local apps will work using the network connection and the servers in the office. And there was a second group of employees. Well, now through the VPN, they do a remote desktop to a system on site, and they work from there. Even more steps, a whole nother round of usernames, passwords, logging in, performance impact. And ideally, you wouldn't want these two experiences to be so different, because what it's saying to the remote worker is your environment is more cumbersome, it's less easy to work, performance will likely be lower, and you won't be able to be as successful when you're working remote as when you're working on site. And so a strategy we have, we talk about managing it all in the hybrid IT environment. What are you managing for? And we have an acronym we've come up with called SPARK, which covers security, performance, availability, reliability, and cost. And I know in the past we've talked about, it's PAR, performance, availability, reliability, has been a term in the IT industry for decades. We've added security, and it's up front because of the priority right now, and cost because none of this will work for you unless you can afford to manage it within your budget. And so diving a little bit deeper, when we talk about security, we're talking about identity and access management. Do you know that it's an employee logging in and they're only seeing what they're supposed to see? Physical device access and control. When you fire up a Windows device, a desktop or a laptop on a domain controlled network in the office, that domain can manage that physical device. How are you going to provide that level of control over your company's computers when they're out of the office? Do you have regulatory or industry compliance issues that you need to adhere to? How's your spam, your virus, your malware, and ransomware protection working for remote workers, particularly if it's BYOD and you don't have as much control or potentially no control over the configuration of the computer that your employees are actually using? Do you have the protections necessary to prevent data loss through breaches or disclosures? And are you properly managing information privacy? All of this gets more complex when you're not locked in and secured in a physical environment behind a physical, information firewall. So it all comes into play in the decisions we make about how we use cloud versus how we use on-premise. Next up is performance, and this is really, what's the time to work? Your startup connection and login. Are the systems equally responsive, remote or on-premise? Is it easy to use? Are there lots of extra steps? And do you still support the workflow that you have when you're in the office, when you're remote? So you want to manage to all of this. Availability is basically uptime versus downtime. We see it also as having access to systems, applications, features, functions, and data, right? If you're supposed to run a report from a data set and you don't have access to the data set, you've got an availability problem. Even though it's really permissions related and not system up, system down, it's still, the data is not available for you to do your work. And so permissions management comes into play, particularly around compliance, your own internal policies, and the role of the admin or the super user. Reliability is uptime and the impact with respect to the frequency of disruptions, the duration, and errors. And the industry talks a lot about time to recover and the RTO, which is the time it takes you to return to operations. And you want to make sure the design of your IT environment, your hybrid IT, has a good return to operations. And there's actually a second acronym and term that's not on here that we use often, which is RTNO, or return to normal operations. And this really relates to business continuity and disaster recovery. so that, we know, for example, in a simple example, I'll give a very simplified example, a solopreneur, a one-person company, their, his or her laptop, the disk drive fails, or the motherboard overheats and is damaged, or there's a memory problem, rendering the laptop unusable, right? So there's a return to operation and there's a return to normal operation. Return to normal operation means that the computer's fixed or replaced, all the applications installed, all the data's there, and any missing work or any lost work has been re-entered, any missing work has been made up. That's a longer time than return to operations. Return to operations is how quickly can I be up and running and continuing to serve the client. And there, that might be I have a spare machine, or or I have a business continuity DR service that says, so long as I have access to any computer with a web browser, I can load up a recent image of my laptop and all of the data and apps and begin working again in a matter of minutes or hours, while it takes the days to fix or replace my laptop, reload it, reprogram it, right? And so, I'm not in normal operations, I am operating, my business is running, I'll convert back to my primary machine when it's up and available, repaired or replaced, and I'll be able to return to normal operations. And all of that comes into play. And there's some additional, there's additional complexity in a hybrid IT environment. There's strategies that we'll talk about that actually can simplify the business continuity and DR capability of your environment. Reliability also involves data integrity. Is the data corrupt? Is it secure? Is it properly managed? As well as, even on your physical devices, your maintenance patches and updates for those components as well. And so that's reliability. And finally, we come to cost, right? And a lot of people say, well, my on-premise systems don't cost much because I've already bought them and they're there. That's true, but we look at the total cost of ownership, which is not just the acquisition, it's the ongoing operation, the support, and eventually the disposition. And what we find is when you actually look at all of those factors in place, the difference between on-premise and cloud is much less, is much less than most people expect. It's much more comparable than people think. And yes, at times cloud is more expensive than on-premise if you look at total cost of ownership. And we'll talk about expense versus value a little bit later on. And other times cloud is less expensive, sometimes significantly so. But the other aspect we looking at cost is, and really this gets into how you manage your business, is capital expenditure versus operating expense, whether costs are fixed or variable, and whether your spending on something is strategic or tactical. And all of this comes into play when you go to manage, if you have a hybrid business now where people are working on premise and working offsite, and you want your IT to be hybrid as well, then you need to assess where you want your fixed and variable costs. On-premise IT solutions tend to have a much higher fixed cost and a lower variable cost. You also end up, paying for capacity you're not using, right? When you buy a server, you're probably expecting to keep that physical device for 3 to 5 years, which is not atypical. Sometimes you might hold on to it longer. So when you scale that server and the storage that comes with it and the networking capacity and the memory and the box, you're looking at what do I use today and what do I think I'm going to need over the next at least 3 years. And granted, most people don't look or know 5 years out. Most people have trouble estimating that for 3 years. So there's a good chance you're purchasing capacity that's effectively going to sit idle and increase that upfront cost, which also increases your maintenance costs on that device. And on the cloud side, things are a lot more variable. You can scale up and down the size of your servers. You can manage the numbers. You can have multiple servers running simultaneously, the same application with load balancing. You can manage the hours of the day the servers are up and running, you're paying for them. It's a more variable cost. Doesn't necessarily mean cloud is less expensive all of the time, but it's a different cost structure. How does that map with your business? And then is the buy strategic versus tactical. And part of all of this, we talk about Spark, what it comes into, and managing it all is really from the business side. How are you evaluating? And there's a general premise that exists that on-premise computing is more convenient for people on-premise than it is for remote. Simpler access, better performance, so the user experience can oftentimes, if you have remote workers and all of your stuff remains physically on site in your office, effectively you're a hosting operation as well, right? And it's going to impact their experience. Other aspects are different as well, right? We know that it's easier to have a secure environment in the cloud than it is on premise. And it's not because your building's not secure or your IT staff isn't capable. It's that the level of sophistication of security in the cloud services is enterprise grade, highly regulated, and highly regulated by industry. And there are easily identifiable standards that have been attained. Right? Most small businesses don't need and can't afford SOC Type 2 certification or certification of ISO standards for information systems and security. That's more easily obtained using cloud services where that infrastructure already meets those requirements. And so this is some of the trade-off. So now we want to talk about strategies to get you there and support that hybrid work environment and what hybrid T looks like. And strategy one is your productivity suite. And I know there's a good chance that everyone who's watching here live today or who's going to absorb this content on demand at a later time are probably thinking, gee, I already have Microsoft 365 or I already have Google Workspace. And that's great if you do. My question to you is, are you really fully utilizing it, right? Most people think about, in the productivity suites, the core applications. Email, calendar, and contacts, the editors, which is your word processor and spreadsheets, presentation tools, and to some extent file services. Typically, in the Microsoft 365 environment, we see a lot of folks using OneDrive, that's personal storage. Some used SharePoint file services, which is shared, and we see Teams starting to grab hold, although it's a different style of interface, it takes some getting used to, creating those shared workspaces. On the Google side, we see a lot of people who just work in Drive and never take advantage of the shared drives and those shared spaces that you have that let you share files and centrally manage permissions rather than have it be individually controlled. And so, what often falls by the wayside in the Office suites is the communications, the shared spaces, but also the chat and the video. The number of companies that are running Google Workspace and Microsoft 365 with Meets and Teams built in, who are still paying for sometimes more than one third-party service for their online web meetings, indicates that they're not fully understanding the capabilities of the systems they have. Granted, there are some exceptions where you need a feature that's available in an advanced, expensive version of Zoom that's not available in Teams or Google Meets. But for most small, mid-sized companies, the capability embedded in Meets or Google Workspace are sufficient. And we've even seen instances where it's more cost-effective to upgrade the Microsoft or Google license than it is to start acquiring and using another communications tool, another meeting tool like Zoom or GoToMeeting, etc., or WebEx. The other area to focus on is identity management. The productivity suites, both Microsoft and Google Workspace, come with identity management tools where your login to that environment can be the key to identifying across multiple applications or services, and includes features that improve security, such as multi-factor authentication at no additional cost. And the final area to leverage your productivity suite is the fact that it's a platform and there are integrated applications and you can integrate others. So if we think of this from a Spark standpoint, security, you've got integrated identity and access management, multi-factor authentication, extensive permissions management, especially if you're using a version of Google Workspace with shared drives, and especially if you're taking advantage of Microsoft Teams and SharePoint file services, then you're centrally managing your permissions. And everyone can access the capabilities of these suites without the need for going through a VPN or doing a PC to PC remote desktop type solution. Performance is better because all the processing load is in the cloud, not on the device. You get much more consistent performance across devices and locations. So again, the user experience for someone remote is going to be nearly identical to user experience for folks in the office. And that capacity scales with your need. These services are available from any device via browser or specific downloadable apps, pretty much over any available internet connection these days. And so your availability is much stronger. And you're much less likely to be susceptible to downtime because your infrastructure hardware in these environments is highly redundant. So the chance of a hardware failure or other outage causing disruption is less when you're working with Google Workspace or Microsoft 365 than if you're running your own infrastructure in-house. And when it comes to cost, it's really a value proposition. For many, they'll look and say, ooh, just cost out the door. On the books of my business, it looks like the cloud and the productivity suite is going to be a little bit more, but you're getting a better user experience. You're getting higher value in large part because things such as improved security, better availability and reliability are built into the environment. So here's some suggestions we make as far as strategy one, hybrid IT for SMBs with your productivity suite. Leverage the collaboration tools. And it's not just saying we've got shared calendars and we can have groups. It's really using the collaboration tools, real-time editing of documents, having a single source of control, understanding how to use the meeting and the chat services, those spaces, the Teams rooms, the channels, the social style of communication that helps bridge the gap between different generations in your workforce. Don't just let people know it's there. Provide support, some education, some cajoling if need be to get them to use it. Embed that into the way you work. Next is migrating file servers to file services. We see many, many small businesses that move into Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, and they start using the file services available to them, but they still keep that physical file server on-premise as a primary tool. That's a disservice to your remote workers where that on-premise server is more difficult or more slow to, from an access standpoint. Whereas migrating the file servers into file servers, all of your information is in the cloud, it's secure, it's protected, and it's accessible at high speed for both on-premise and remote workers. As I sort of alluded to earlier, standardized on the included communication tools. Get people using Google Meets, get them using Microsoft Teams, provide some education and support to get them comfortable with it, and seriously evaluate if anyone says, well, I prefer Zoom or I need to use Zoom, and evaluate that and keep that from really becoming acceptable shadow IT. And one client said to us, gee, I love using Microsoft Teams. It's great. It integrates one-click, inclusion when we schedule meetings, but we have a Zoom account because we have customers who prefer Zoom. And my question is, well, if the customer prefers Zoom, then when you're scheduling a meeting with them, why don't you send your meeting invite with Teams and simply say, hey, if you prefer to use Zoom for this meeting, please send us the link and use their Zoom account, right? They have it. That's their preference. There's no need for you to pay for two. We've actually talked to some clients of ours who are so concerned about meeting system compatibility that in addition to Teams, that's with their Meets with their Google Workspace environment, they paid for a Teams account, they're paying for WebEx, and they're paying for GoTo, and they're paying for Zoom, so that they can initiate any meeting in the format that their client regards. And I look at that and say that's a lot of money, probably not for a lot of benefit or any marginal benefit at all. Next up is take the time and the effort to deploy the identity and access management. Use those features to secure your accounts, your user identities, at the very least multi-factor authentication. There are other capabilities built into both of these systems. And once you verify the identity and they're in, make sure you're using the permissions capabilities to control which applications, what data sets, what aspects of the environment people are allowed to use. In environments that need to be highly secured, for example, both Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace have features around privileged access management, for example, where even IT administrators don't have universal access to the system. If they need to get into some of the controls, they have to get temporary access and remove that access once they're done. And finally, integrate other applications. Take advantage of the integration capabilities, not just on the identity, but on the data, on the workflow side of things, of moving information back and forth, so that the productivity suite, whether it's Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, becomes a cornerstone of your business technology foundation and an integrated part of your environment. And interestingly enough, for some companies, when they look at that integration of other applications, in some cases, in a few cases, it triggers a re-examination of whether Google Workspace or Microsoft 365 is right for you. Because when you start to think about integrating other applications and how those systems are running, whether they're SaaS systems or hosted systems, running on a SQL Server backend, whatever they might be, integrating those applications with your productivity suite and other tools might warrant a switch in platform to make the integration and the overall environment better. Strategy 2 is SaaS solutions, and this is sort of like step 2. You've got your productivity suite down. Now look at your business applications, the tools and services, that you might ramp up, and there's a whole set of logos on the right-hand side for whether it's sales or marketing. There are a line of business apps now. Can those be delivered as SaaS and get those off-premise into the cloud? Now, there are times they can't. We've worked with a number of companies, for example, that run some versions of Sage, and they have third-party add-ons and customizations that aren't available in the SaaS version that Sage offers. Right? There are other options for those companies. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But if you're able to use the SaaS version of a product, you offload the demand on server, storage, backup and restore, malware management on the device. It's not just the hardware and the on-premise you're eliminating. You're gaining security, you're gaining integration, and you're gaining better access to both your in-house and your remote workers. So it fits that hybrid model. And again, here, a lot of SaaS applications now have the ability to link identity or do federated login with your underlying platform. And there's some pros and cons of that we're happy to talk to you about. But oftentimes, you can also get integration of file services. So if you're creating files in another application, you can save them in Google Drive, shared drives. You can save them in Teams or in OneDrive, as well as they'll use your productivity suite for email and other communications. And then there's services around that. So from a security standpoint, think about SaaS applications. Most of them are running in ISO and SOC certified environments. As I mentioned, multi-factor authentication, the ability to integrate with single sign-on tools to make your user experience even better. And again, eliminating the need for VPN or device-to-device remote desktop solution for people when they're out of the office. Again, performance, the processing load is in the cloud, not on your device. A side effect of that, and we'll talk about this in other aspects, is that your end user devices should last longer. You won't need to upgrade them because they're too slow or don't have enough power. You're only doing the I/O component. All the processing is up in the cloud, consistent performance across devices and locations. And again, a single user experience for all employees, whether they're in the office, working remotely, or they're hybrid back and forth on an individual basis. These apps tend to be available on almost any device by browser or any device by browser, and some have also platform-specific apps as well. And you just need that internet connection going. Again, highly reliable, less susceptible to hardware failures because they're designed not to have those single or dual points of failures that are so expensive to overcome when you're building a server or service on premise. And cost. You're not investing in infrastructure, network, servers, databases, storage, redundancy, etc. So what's left and what's left? What's next? Well, what's left is what's next, and that what do you do about your business applications, databases, file servers, domain controllers, etc., where you're not able to use the SaaS version? And this is what we get to, and there's two different terms that are slightly different, but they tend to be used interchangeably. We will here too, which is remote desktop environments or virtual desktop infrastructure. And there's a little bit of simple model for doing it in Azure environment. We do it in GCP as well. The remote desktop environment is where you're shifting computing to the cloud. You need a server to run a custom business application. It's a client server app. You need a client. Instead of hosting that server in a data center somewhere off-site to avoid the on-premise issues, you're actually running on a virtual server inside a cloud environment like Azure or Google Cloud Platform. But the difference is you're not accessing from the physical client on your desktop. You're using that client to connect to a remote client or a remote desktop, if you will, that'll access it. So effectively in the Azure environment, you'll see here's an example of Active Directory. You've got your Active Directory server and you've got your Windows hosts. Right? So you have virtually desktop PCs, full Windows 10 environment that are on a Windows network in a secure data center that's incredibly high speed, high performance, and highly secure. And that's where you're going to set up your servers and your storage and other things you need to run your applications, not on the local device. In effect, your laptop, desktop, phone, or tablet simply become a window into that environment. And so it's a fundamental shift into cloud computing. Locally is that user interface. And the client you're going to access, it can be just through the web browser, but most VDI and remote desktop services have a custom secure client you can install that not only encrypts all the data at rest and in motion, but will let you manage access to local resources. So when you're working in the cloud, on a cloud-based application, you need to print something, it'll see the local printer connected physically or over the network to your local machine. You'll be able to print locally. And when we look at this and we go through the Spark now, we're going to do it in a little more detailed version here. But being cognizant of the time, I will keep this moving. And again, feel free to ask questions along the way. So strategy 3 is remote desktop and VDI. And there are a lot of security benefits to having everything in the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, these are ISO and SOC certified environments. Microsoft and Google have thousands of security engineers and specialists designing, maintaining, supporting, and watching their environments, well beyond the capability of any individual small or mid-sized company. And so these environments are secure and compliant. Important to this hybrid environment is the identity and access management services are integrated. And if you're using Microsoft 365 and you build your remote desktop environment in Azure, the same user identity and login process works for both. It's one account, it's one password, it's easy to manage. It's for the user, it's an easy experience, easy to manage for the IT team or for us on an outsourced basis. And again, there's little or no local data that reduces your risk. It improves your security. And in reliability of the secure environment. One thing to note is it's a shared responsibility model, right? So Microsoft and Google are going to focus on the security of the environment and the login process. Within the environment, you have control over permissions. So you have control whether information is disclosed externally or not, and who within your organization can see it. That shared responsibility extends into backup and recovery of data as well. From a performance angle, I'd say the two big, hot bullet points here is you have consistent performance for all users. You don't have some on a high-speed local network and some connecting remotely. over lower speed internet or through VPN that adds overhead and hurts performance. You have that single user experience in the hybrid environment. It fosters the hybrid work culture. It fosters better collaboration. And it makes it easier to manage a hybrid business than having local resources that people are accessing remotely, to have them in a central cloud location in a way that's also, from a performance standpoint, highly scalable and independent from the individual client configuration. I guess as I think about it, I should have highlighted that fourth point, is the third point as well. The fact that your remote desktop environment is, the performance is somewhat independent from the client configuration, is important when we get to cost, because it will extend the life of your desktops and laptops. Because you're not doing all of the heavy processing and data management locally, it's all in the cloud. The demand you need for those resources on your end user device is significantly less. And so we see companies not having to upgrade for performance reasons, which extends the life of desktops and laptops. For laptops, the 2 to 3 year range now becomes 3 to 5, and desktops, certainly a 3 to 4 year lifetime is now 5+ years. Given that you're not overloading the system as new applications and new capabilities come into play. From availability, your cloud environments, you gain, again, this is part of the cost, but you gain built-in and scalable redundancy. At a very basic level, off the bat, you have options to enhance it to whatever your business requires. There are integrated backup and recovery services that you can take advantage of, and you're protected from local issues. I mean, people say, well, what if the internet goes out at my office? It's great. Move someplace else. You can go home. You can go to the coffee shop. You're not dead in the water. If you're running your business and everything's on premise and the network switch dies in your server room and no one can access your server, you're done until you get a new switch in place, right? Ironically, the internet goes down, you can move someone else, and you're in the cloud, you can move someone else and get that access. Similarly, reliability. I know there are outages. People say, but there are outages. Yes, Microsoft has outages, Google has outages, Amazon has outages, but the reality is these are top-tier infrastructure. The chance of an outage, the duration and severity of an outage are going to be less than if you're building your own infrastructure, managing it, and securing. Most small and mid-sized businesses don't have the resources, the money, or the personnel to fully manage and secure anything more than a basic on-premise environment. And if you're running business applications, if you're running databases, you want that infrastructure in place for you. So again, reliability, you avoid those local hardware network issues. It's top-tier infrastructure, as I mentioned before, that's professionally managed and secured. And those operations are audited and certified. And this comes to cost. And I'll look at cost in two ways, CapEx and OpEx. CapEx is capital expenditures. You're avoiding major upgrades. Every 4 or 5 years, you're not going to be buying a server, buying disk arrays, or a storage area network, or anything like that. You will, as I mentioned earlier, extend the life of your client devices. Typically, we're seeing right now about 2 years of extended life, so you're avoiding additional capital spending there. You can eliminate ancillary servers. So even if you're using virtual machines, right, a basic Windows network has a domain controller, a backup domain controller, and a file server. And that's before you put in an application server or a database server. If you've got people accessing remotely, you need a terminal server. Now, chances are you're not going to have 6 physical servers, but there's a good chance you're going to have 2 physical servers or 3 physical servers with 3 or 2 respectively virtual machines on each. Moving into the cloud, you don't need that on-premise those domain controllers anymore. Your file server can become a file service in the cloud. And then the question is, can the application run remotely or not? Even if the application's running locally, you're not having those other ancillary servers in there, adding additional cost management and support. And so along those lines, you can reduce your on-premise infrastructure. We've seen companies that have gone all in with the cloud where they're able to, and they've moved into new office space, and they didn't do an IT build out other than putting in their core switches, the firewall router, a core set of switches, and wireless access points. No in-the-wall wiring, no counting jacks, no drop cables. They simplified the environment with reduced infrastructure because they're using soft phones on their computers for their telephone, or they've got wireless antenna on their physical desk phones if they still need a physical phone for various reasons. And everything's in the cloud. They're not focused on how fast can I get the data to the server in the server room. It's how well do I connect to the network, which has that broadband connection up to my cloud environment. And because it's only the input-output that's going over the wire, not the processing, you get a lot more bang for your bandwidth buck there. From an operating expense side, the two big points here is that we can scale your services to meet demand throughout the day and the week. And so, we're working with one client now. They have about 20 people. And yes, during the day, anywhere from 12 to 20 people need access to the system, but 8 of those people don't need it all the time. They're in for a bit in the morning. They might be in the afternoon. And then in the evenings, there are only 2 to 4 people. So rather than on premise, you would have one big server that everyone accesses. In the cloud, we're actually going to be running this load balanced over 4 servers. There's one that'll always be running for those 2 to 4 people who can be on it any time, day or night. And basically, as soon as the 4th person logs in, the 2nd server spins up and waits for the next 4. And those additional servers will spin up and spin down over the course of the day, minimizing the charges and tuning the charges and the capacity to the demand it had. Heading into the busy season, we'll change that schedule so that more servers are standing by if needed, or adjust the parameters for how quickly they spin up or spin down so no one's left waiting a minute or so to get in. We can adapt for that. That kind of ability lets you manage the operating expense of cloud. At the same time, you're still providing better access. So as we look to wrap it up, what's the action? What's the action for you? What are your next steps here today? And so one, there's a QR code you can scan with your phone that goes to a bit.ly link that'll get you an intro call with one of our cloud advisors. This is a no obligation free call. Talk to us about your needs, your hybrid work environment, where you are with hybrid IT, what's working, what's not, what would you like to be better, and let's talk about your Spark. And that's really a starting point. For you, whether you contact us or not, assess your environment and needs. What can and cannot run in the cloud, what should not move. Are you fully taking advantage of the cloud services you have? Is your security tools up to snuff? Are you protected enough against malware or ransomware? Are you able not only to recover, but recover well enough to minimize any negative impact on your business should something bad happen, whether it's a cyber attack or a natural disaster? From there, understanding where you're ready and what your needs are, define your value proposition. We always recommend a holistic view of IT services. And let's take a look. If we made X, Y, and Z changes to your environment to better support your hybrid workforce, would it increase your cost or lower your cost? And even if it increases cost, what's the cost of inaction? How much productivity are you losing? How much more are you spending in IT services to maintain an inefficient environment for your business? When we plan any changes to your environment, when we plan your solution, we'll work with you and design for Spark: security, performance, availability, reliability, and cost. Cost has equal weight to all of those other things. We're not going to spend money for the sake of it. It's got to add value to the equation, and it all has to be designed again around your business needs. And of course, once we have that plan, we're going to help you to execute, make sure it gets deployed, your staff is trained and comfortable, and that you're comfortable with the outcome as well. And so I've covered a lot of ground today and really talked about some strategies for hybrid IT that better support hybrid work environments, but also in the context of understanding the underlying features you need of any IT system, which are not just the features and functions, but that security, performance, availability, reliability, and cost. And so at this point, I open it up to questions. If you haven't opened the questions window now is a good time to do it. If you're watching us on demand and you have a question or comment or just want to discuss some ideas, reach us, info@cumulusglobal.com. Use the bit.ly link or the QR code to schedule an appointment with us. No, again, no obligation. And we'll bring the right people onto the call. If you want to reach me, I don't have an assistant. My phone number and email address are here on the screen. Please use the email. I'm bad about answering the call when I'm busy, and I'm horrible about checking and responding to voice messages. In fact, I think if you leave a voice message, my outgoing will tell you you're better off sending an email than leaving the voice message, afalcon@cumulusglobal.com. So at this point, I'm going to wrap it up. For those of you watching on demand, thanks for taking time to do so. And again, contact us if you have any questions or want to continue the discussion. For those of you online, I'm going to take a second, halt the recording, and I'll be back to answer any additional questions you might have.